Vietnam and Communist China and the events regarding Thayer events overseas. What do you think are the intentions of Beijing behind the introduction of the oil rig, Beijing Shiyu 891 into Vietnamese waters?
I think it's still unclear. There's both the tactical and strategic answers to those questions. The immediate timing I would call unexpected, because in October last year, the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang visited Vietnam, and Chinese press reported a breakthrough in relations. And the two sides reached agreement to set up 3 working groups, including one on the maritime areas. And they also had several statements that no one would take an action that would interfere with the other side. So relations were on an upward trajectory, and then out of the blue, because there was no provocation I can discern from Vietnam's side, the oil rig was placed there. But the larger strategic question is quite clear. The China 9-dash line is not just some imaginary map. It's in the Chinese mind that this is their legitimate sphere of influence. And they have promulgated regulations from Hainan Island to regulate fishing. They use a strong Chinese domestic legal basis to assert their claims. So everything that in their eyes that they do is legal. And it's really out to dominate and have other countries in the region recognize that China has sovereignty and sovereign rights over what China traditionally feels are its islands and its waters. And so placing the rig where they did was just, from their own point of view, a normal exercise of sovereignty. And indeed, China was quite confused in its earlier attempts to explain it, saying first it was in the territorial waters. Well, that's 12 nautical miles, but at the same time they said it was 17 nautical miles from Dao Triton, Triton Island, so it was outside. Then later they amended that to say it was in the contiguous zone, which is the next 12 kilometers, but the contiguous zone is only for finance and customs and a few other details. So China is not using it at modern international law to justify it. But the placement of the rig is that Chinese sovereignty and sovereign rights are, in this particular case, over the resources, the potential gas, very little expectation of oil in that area. So, but the immediate timing, I think, still needs to be explained, because Vietnam wasn't exactly in China's pocket, but it wasn't joining the American rebalancing. And although it's unclear that Vietnam has decided to move towards the United States, certainly domestically in Vietnam, China's actions have been counterproductive. So I'm still querying about the exact timing and location. And I don't think it's an accident. I don't think the China National Offshore Oil Company and elements of the People's Liberation Army Navy can just suddenly decide to move a rig with as many ships as they did, and then create, which I don't think the Chinese expected, a very strong Vietnamese reaction. So the timing and the target Vietnam are still unclear to me. The broader strategic goal, I think, is very clear. It is that the South China Sea is China's historically, and they will keep doing everything they can to assert that right.
So what, in your opinion, should Vietnam do at the present time to counter the Chinese actions and prevent similar moves in the future?
Well, Vietnam is in a weak position, and the weak have very few weapons except diplomacy and international law. It's quite clear that the military response by Vietnam would have been met with overwhelming force by Vietnam, and Vietnam prudently kept its navy in the port. So Vietnam has very little options, because when China deployed, I got calls in the morning, it was 50 ships, then 70, 80, and now well over 100 with a core of military ships. China was trying to show overwhelming force. So Vietnam has to do several things. One, it has to, at minimum under international law, show that it is not acquiescing. So the Vietnamese Coast Guard and Maritime and Fishery Surveillance Force go there and broadcast in 3 languages that this is Vietnamese sovereign territory and China should go out. So China can never claim internationally that Vietnam has acquiesced in that. 2, diplomacy, and one is both within ASEAN, a regional body, and then with other outside powers. And this oil rig incident occurred before the annual meeting of the ASEAN foreign ministers. And for the first time, they issued a standalone statement expressing serious concern about recent developments that affected peace and security. And although they didn't name China, they never have named China since their first statement in 1992. But that's important because there has been some disarray in ASEAN. And this time, and I'm told, even though Cambodia was beginning to raise questions, Malaysia came in quite strongly. So at least from an ASEAN, or Vietnamese point of view, the regional body has expressed concern. And that's important for countries like the United States, because it gives them a foundation for intervening in support of ASEAN. And particularly at the CSIS conference in July this year, it was made very clear by administration spokesmen that the U.S. is pressing international law and freezing activities that upset the status quo. So there's diplomacy, and with Japan, the response will be to increase assistance to Vietnam for its Coast Guard, and the Diet of Japan in July is considering this particular issue. So Vietnam has raised it. Tried diplomacy with China as a first recourse, and that got nowhere. When Li Keqiang was there, they mentioned hotlines, and the Vietnamese picked up hotlines and got no reply. They asked for a special envoy, and they didn't even offer the Secretary General of the Communist Party of Vietnam to go to Beijing, and that was turned down. And at the Shangri-La dialogue, I asked the Vietnamese defense minister in a public session to ask where this is going, and he replied there have been over 30 contacts. Being diplomatic, he says China has not yet responded. So China is playing a tough game with Vietnam. So the use of the paramilitary forces, Coast Guard and fisheries is one way of exerting a Vietnamese presence, but it's a losing one. China has expanded the area of control, inflicted damage on at least 29 ships, and there are not very many ships of sufficient weight. The largest in Vietnam is 2,000, and that's almost the starting lineup for China. So it is an unequal contest, but it's made its point. Diplomacy, both within regionally and then with external powers. But after that, there's very little that Vietnam can do. And within regional circles, and I think globally, if Vietnam should rise and be provoked, then China will turn the tables and say, is Vietnam is the aggressor and upsetting everything. So that's been the response of Vietnam, and all they can do is hope that come the middle of August, when China initially said the oil rig would complete its work, that it will be withdrawn. And when it goes, this is before the typhoon season, then both sides will have no reason to keep maritime forces in this area, and that might open the door to dialogue.
As you can see, Hanoi has not been able to rally the ASEAN nations behind its very hesitant position on this issue. This is a sharp contrast to the Philippines, which has earned the support of the U.S. and many nations because of its transparent moves. Do you think that the Vietnamese communists will have the courage to stand up to China as the Philippines do?
Well, I think in the Philippines case, and it's a lesson for Vietnam, and we've heard here, they had X number of years, so many sessions with China, and when they finally made a statement of claim for an international arbitral tribunal, they said they had virtually exhausted all possibilities of discussion. And China keeps saying the door is open. But quite frankly, the discussions are you first accept Chinese sovereignty and then you can discuss. And high-level Filipino officials have told me that, and that's inconceivable that they could ever accept that. But the Philippines is a U.S. ally and Vietnam isn't, and since this problem, the U.S. and the Philippines have enhanced defense cooperation. For Vietnam's case, the Prime Minister of Vietnam has made public that Vietnam is considering legal action and said it's the timing. But at the Shangri-La dialogue, when Phu Quang Thanh was the defense minister was asked, he said it's a last resort. And the importance there is I met Filipinos just before, and they just come back from Hanoi, and they say, oh, Vietnam is preparing 2 cases, one on the Paracels, one on the Spratlys. They're going to join us. After the general statement, they said they're only using us. Then the question becomes, if Vietnam takes legal action, what issues will they raise? And then for what purpose? If we separate the Paracels from the Spratlys, at a minimum, and this was advocated by an international jurist from Belgium, that Vietnam could merely issue and table with the tribunal that the Philippines has had convened a statement of interest, that Vietnam has an interest in the outcome. That doesn't mean Vietnam takes any side, But if other countries follow suit, the arbiter says they really take note when these statements of interest pile up, that it's just not just bilateral. So that's one. Two, Vietnam could join the Philippines, and that may be difficult because some of the Philippines' points would undermine Vietnam's position. Or Vietnam could go independently and ask for its own arbitral tribunal, in which case there may be differences between the Philippines and Vietnam that work to hurt both sides to China's benefit, depending on how it's done. Then the issue of the paracels, well, Vietnam claims sovereignty over that because it was taken by an act of aggression by China in 1974. There is no recourse to expect a legal outcome because you need China's acquiescence and agreement, and they won't do it. But again, international lawyers have suggested that Vietnam attempt to do that anyway, at least to show that it's willing to settle disputes through international law. So it could go to the International Court of Justice and want to raise the sovereignty issue. It wouldn't get anywhere. But even a Japanese minister has suggested that Sengaku could go there, and China, putting the onus on China to decide what to do. Then a third issue that arose when I was in Da Nang is the outrage by the Vietnamese fishing community over damage to their livelihoods and boats, and how do they seek compensation. And they were asking all the international specialists how they could take legal action. And the answer is that the only actors that are acceptable are states. And if maritime vessels are involved, it can only be the state whose flag is flown on the boats. In this case, it's the Vietnamese government. So the pressure is on the Vietnamese government to take such action. But by giving stress to the legal route, then Vietnam will find the endorsement of ASEAN, the political endorsement, and that's all it will be. But given the shift in emphasis of U.S. policy to back a rules-based approach on international law, then Vietnam can expect to find support not only from the U.S. but Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, all the other major maritime actors. But recourse to international law has its drawbacks. That in the Philippines case, if a judgment comes down, it's immediate and not subject to appeal, but there's no enforcement mechanism. And so we're stuck that if China decides to toughen it out and not accept the judgment, we haven't advanced much more except to put normative and legal pressure on China to join the international community.
Vietnamese-Chinese relations had many up and downs. They're very different during the Vietnam War, after, and especially after the collapse of communism in Soviet and Eastern Europe. The Zhengzhou Conference in September 1990 is said to have redefined Chinese-Vietnamese relations. In your point of view, how are these relationships meant to be? Are they still ruled by ideological tie, or is it merely a big fish, small fry relationship, a kind of replay of the celestial empire with a vassal state? Or is it now a new expression of Chinese chauvinism at its worst?
Well, in 1990, when Vietnam sought rapprochement with China, it proposed the following year an alliance. And the Chinese replied, Đồng chí không phải đồng minh, we can be comrades but not allies. So the essential aspect of the relationship is its asymmetry. China is the more powerful country. And from 1990, Vietnam has sought to be the loyal member of a new tributary system. And ideology definitely plays a role. And I recall that in 1992, that's just shortly after, there was the ExxonMobil, the Crestone affair, and then there was the Tu Chin Reef Wen An Bay incident where China tried to put an oil rig. And as Vietnam Central Committee debated, Murray Hebert, who was then the Far Eastern Economic Review correspondent, quoted a senior source as saying that the Chinese are using socialism like a rope to tie Vietnam's hands. How do you use ideology to curry favor with China and expect rewards? That's called bandwagoning in international relations. How can you do that? Well, then what happens if China changes tack? So I think Vietnam has always thought that they could use ideology to insinuate, as they have a special relationship with China. And since normalization, they've created a strategic partner, a comprehensive strategic partner. The parties have signed long-range agreements on comprehensive cooperation. On the state level, they set up a joint steering committee. So in Vietnam had thought that it could compartmentalize the South China Sea dispute, but by using ideology and an accommodating policy towards China, bandwagon to get economic benefits. And that's why when the oil rig was placed, and after, as I mentioned, Li Keqiang's visit, it seemed like a complete reversal. It undermined strategic trust. So Vietnam today is still debating that, and I'm joking with the Vietnamese, but it's serious. If you're going to use socialism, it better be socialism with Vietnamese characteristics, where national interests come to the fore. And you know, the adoption of Loy Dân Thọ was a very controversial decision when it was finally used in discourse in Vietnam, because it wasn't ideological. It's about workers and social forces and not nations. And in 2003, and then it was reviewed in 2013, Vietnam was identifying China and the US as objects of cooperation, Doi Tak, and operations of struggle or opposition, Doi Tu. And this 2013 review was to decide whether they were using this effectively. In other words, for socialist countries, you have areas of cooperation but disagreement, so you have to stand firm. And with the American imperialists, you have large areas of disagreement on human rights, democracy, but you have convergence of interests and how to play the two. And so today, the inability of Vietnam to respond to China's aggression by firming up a relationship with the United States, not for immediate tactical ends, but make a commitment to long-term opening the Vietnamese economy, joining the TPP, and then seeking all the other benefits of education, science and technology exchanges, is lip service. That comprehensive partnership agreement is evidence of that. All it did was tell us what they've already been doing. And so today there's a hesitancy, and ideology is behind that, because it still sees itself as socialist, and it still wants to use that as a way of enticing Chinese cooperation. But the obverse of the coin is socialism with Chinese characteristics, and that is dominance by China.
So many Vietnamese believe that the Communist Party of Vietnam is too indebted to China to be able to shake off its obligations that it owes to China. What is your assessment of this point of view, which is rather widespread in Vietnam, found even within the rank and the file of the CPV?
Difficult, and it will be a struggle, because party members who are educated overseas, and particularly those that I interact with, I wrote an article once calling it the tyranny of geography, and I was playing on a book about Australia called The Tyranny of Distance, that Australia is white, European, and it's in Asia, and the distance, it would be better to be in the North Atlantic, close to America. And by tyranny of geography, of course, I meant the asymmetric relation that Vietnam, with 90 million people, is only a middle-sized Chinese province. Their response is, oh, that's too negative of you. We get many positive things from China: culture, political thought, ideology. But Vietnam cannot deny its heritage, but it's how to creatively reinterpret it, because the essential point is Vietnamese national identity and Vietnamese national interest. After all, they achieved independence from Vietnam. And again, you're correct about that, because a comment I've heard on more recent visits is our China specialists think like Chinese, and that was meant really as a criticism. In other words, China doesn't always have to be overbearing, because Vietnamese anticipate Chinese reaction and begin to be the obedient servant by, oh, if we do this, move to the United States, China will come down. So what we do is don't move towards the United States and try to alleviate that pressure. That policy has been a failure, as we can see. The multipolar arrangement that Vietnam wanted, balancing China, Russia, India, Japan, US, only the latter three are constant in their policies. Russia, because of its problems with the US, sold gas to China and now is a questionable partner. If there's a conflict, it won't side with Vietnam against China. And China, which was the major country to the only comprehensive strategic partner at the highest pecking order in the Vietnam hierarchy, is now doing things that completely undermine the relationship. So, but I think the inevitable result, though, from younger people with the party congress coming up. We've seen the Central Committee be much more assertive, and they're not the most young people of Vietnam, but there will be a leadership change. More and more thinking is going to come into the party that globalization really means recreating Vietnamese identity to be Vietnamese in a global world, but not Vietnamese in a Sino-centric world.
What is your prognostication of Chinese moves in the days to come, say in the next few months to a year or two? Would China continue with its aggressiveness, especially as it believes that the U.S. is too preoccupied elsewhere to mount effective collective effort to counter its moves?
Well, we can look at what China is doing rather than what it says. That oil rig was built to go into deep waters. It's very, very expensive. And they are building and have built many other rigs. And they're expanding the size of their Coast Guard. They've unified their paramilitary forces. Their military is moving along at double-digit increases in defense budget every year. That's a momentum that will take decades to reverse. And so I think that trend is quite clear. You don't build oil rigs to sit at home. You go out there to find oil and exploit it. And China has convinced itself that the reserves in the South China Sea are 7 times greater than the official U.S. estimates of the EIA here in the U.S. And so you could see in their mind that this is a valuable resource. They've hyped, to use the Chinese word, the energy in that. They're also driven by local interests in fisheries. They polluted their own waters, depleted the stocks, and they built bigger and bigger boats in moving south. So ultimately there's going to be a collision, not just with Vietnam and the Philippines, that's what's happening now, but Malaysia and Indonesia. And we're already seeing, particularly at the CSIS conference, the Malaysian presenter revealed new information that in the Malaysian parliament, speaking in Malay, the defense minister revealed about Chinese encroachments, not just on James Shoal, which is public, but Laconia, on two separate reefs. And this is not, and it was put in the Malay version of the Congressional Record, their Hansard, so it's called. And it hasn't got much publicity because no one's reading the Malay. But he put it now that it's been spoken. And Indonesia has been quietly releasing on YouTube video footage of its own maritime forces, going back several years now, showing incidents with China. And both countries have increased their military, both have sought to bolster relations with the United States, mainly on the quiet, not trumpeting it like the Philippines would do. So those trends are there. I think the future is not one of regional peace, security, and cooperation, but it's one of contestation, because China, the juggernaut of energy, of fishing, of enforcement capability, and military muscle against the relative decline of the U.S., not the complete decline, but that China's power is growing. And that it's very hard, even from my position in Australia, a firm American ally, to look at the infighting in Washington, the funding problems, to say, well, the U.S., its heart is in the right place, but it's a global power, and if things go wrong in the Middle East, that will distract the United States from Asia Pacific. And China's been clever enough not to use military means, but other means to advance its interest. And all of us in the region have to confront that over the next several decades.
There is a lot of anti-Chinese feelings in Vietnam, as one can see in demonstrations both inside Vietnam and the diaspora. Do you think that serves any purpose, or do you feel that we should act at a more strategic level?
Well, nationalism and patriotism are double-edged swords. They're good in the right occasions, but if they prompt decisions to be made in the heat of the moment, or rash decisions, then they can be counterproductive. And I sometimes go on overseas radio stations and Vietnamese, like, they want to play chess with China and grab the first piece. And I say, do you know what's going to happen 2 moves later? Now I say, you want to play chess with China, they get twice the number of pieces in the game that you have. So you have to be very, very careful. But the nationalism of Vietnam is at odds with their leadership, and that's very clear when I go there. Prime Minister Nguyen Thanh Xuyen, who's spoken most directly of all the leaders, his popularity has risen and skyrocketed, whereas before he's been very criticized for his handling of the economy. And that's in contrast to other leaders. And that just tells me there are differences. But the nationalism, although there are expressions from the president and from the party secretary general that Vietnam has to defend its sovereignty, that's more for domestic consumption. So I think that China has got to be convinced that the domestic forces of Vietnam are strong and are influencing it, and that its policies are wrong. But if we turn the clock back to previous demonstrations, when a special envoy from Vietnam went to China, they agreed to steer public opinion. And then there was the repression of demonstrations at home. But now we could see from many Vietnamese intellectuals and retired party officials, and even this month, Tuong Lai writing his op-ed piece, and that's a person I met in 1981, that stalwarts of the regime, now retired particularly, like mandarins of old, could use the moral authority that they're out of office to express their discontent. And again, I think it's the ideology and it's the risk-adverse nature of the Politburo, not wanting to upset anything. I wouldn't advocate rash acts, but in this particular case, Vietnam is foreclosing options by not being more nationalistic and saying we have as much right as Australia to form relations with the United States. China keeps telling us to end the alliance, it's Cold War. We keep telling them we'll trade with you, but that's not negotiable. And Vietnam has to have that same sense of who and what the country is. And young people, again, my visits in recent times have been to regional universities. They are demanding discussion on the South China Sea, and that's why foreigners get invited to say things that many Vietnamese officials and thinkers cannot really say in public, but only in these closed venues. The pressure will only build up on the government over the next several years, particularly as the next party Congress approaches. I don't think anybody can stand for election within the party and try to push a policy of accommodation with China. But it can't be one of unremitting, uncompromising opposition. What they have to sell is a new reorientation in Vietnam's foreign relations, and a new basis that ideology is not the basis for cooperation with China. It should be pure economic interest and national interest.
So thank you, Professor Thayer, for your time to share point of views and your insights into the whole situation. We really appreciate it.